Hello and welcome back to Adventures in Marketing. I am your host, Gwen Montoya. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have not subscribed or followed the podcast, make sure that you do that so that you get new episode alerts. And if you have not left me a review, today is a great day to leave me a review. I would really appreciate it, especially if you're enjoying the podcast. Today's episode is actually a little bit meta, speaking of podcasts, because what we're going to talk about is creating a podcast. And the reason I want to talk about this is that it is a really common set of questions that I get asked and that I see being asked. And so I kind of wanted to create a little resource and share what worked for me when I started mine and what didn't work and how maybe I can save you some time and some shortcuts and make it a little bit easier for you. So the first question is, why did I create Adventures in Marketing as a podcast? And the truth is, I thought it would be faster than blogging. Because I am a torturously slow blog post writer. I love the creation process. I love every single piece that goes into it, but I am not fast and it takes me forever. And I thought I can talk faster than I can write. And overall, that has been true. However, I did not anticipate the editing process and the publication process and some other pieces. Overall, I still think that probably a podcast is faster for me than blogging, but then I don't have things for my blog. So it is definitely a either or kind of situation for me rather than both. Although I will talk about how to transcribe podcasts because that is a very common question also later in this episode. So the other challenge for me when I created this podcast is that when I was little, like very little, I had a lot of ear infections and I had some hearing loss. And so I actually had to go to quite a bit of speech therapy, and sometimes I mess up my words, and the editing that I do usually comes through having to edit out all of my word jumbles that happen sometimes. And it's not obviously a huge deal for me anymore, but it does mean that I have to be in a really focused headspace when I record podcasts or when I do any kind of speaking, because if you follow this podcast, you have probably also seen me speak in other places. And it does take some practice for me to make sure that I get my words out in the right order and in all of the ways that they're supposed to be. So it's just a thing that I had to be really conscious of when I record podcasts. And it was one of the things that for me was a little bit of a stumbling block to get started. But I am so glad that I have this podcast. I love recording these for you guys. And it's really one of the favorite things that I get to do, even though, and I will talk about this also, consistency is not my strong suit when it comes to this. So that's why I created it. I thought it would be faster than blogging. I also saw a lot of podcasts out there that covered a lot of really in-depth marketing pieces, or there were a lot of interviews, but I wasn't seeing something that was very quick, very direct, very to the point, got you in and out really fast. And I kind of wanted to be that person because that's the kind of information I know that my audience really, really craves. The people that I work with, the people that follow me typically are juggling a lot of things and they don't have a lot of time to spend an hour on a podcast where there's a lot of bantering and there's a lot of back and forth. So that's kind of what I wanted to do when I created this podcast. And obviously I am a giant research nerd. So when it came time for me to even think about having a podcast, I did a ton of research. And what I found were some things that kind of created some roadblocks for me, and I'm hoping that by talking about them here, they will remove them as roadblocks for you. And I'm not saying that these things aren't important, but I am saying that in some instances, depending on which links you click, depending on which blog posts you read, it can be really intimidating to run across these people and feel like you're never going to measure up. So I want to talk about that first. Number one is the sound snobs. There are so many people who get very, very into podcast sound, and I totally get that, and I respect that. That is not me. I think the sound on this podcast works for what it does. I'm more interested in presenting the information than making a perfect podcast. There are some people who record in closets, and that's great if you need a place to record. All of that stuff in your closet, it will mute your sound or will deaden sound around you and make your voice sound better, which is great. I highly suggest that if you need a place. But I have also seen people who feel like they can't start a podcast because they don't have a perfect closet or they don't have a podcast room or a booth or they have to build one in their house. And I really think that that's one of the ways that we stop ourselves from moving forward, is trying to make it perfect before we even start. And honestly, it's never going to be perfect. So just start. Just keep going and do your best. The other thing is the format snobs also. The idea that it has to follow a certain pattern, or you have to have an intro or an outro. If you notice, in my early episodes, I did have that. I've never had music on my podcast. But in early episodes, I did do a recorded intro and a recorded outro. But over time, that felt stifling to me and I didn't enjoy it. The process of starting my podcast after an intro like that just felt stale to me and I didn't want to do it that way. So I got rid of it. I have not had any feedback that says that somebody will stop listening to my podcast because I do not have a proper intro or outro. If you feel better, if you feel like you need to have one, then by all means do that. But also recognize that if you're stopping yourself from creating one because you haven't found the perfect music, you haven't found the perfect voice person to create an intro or an outro for you, or any of those things, just recognize that that might be your own stumbling block and not necessarily something that you have to have. The tool snobs. I edit this podcast on Audacity. I record it and I edit it on Audacity. It's a free program. It works great. I have a Blue Yeti microphone that is secondhand. I didn't even buy it new. It was gifted to me. It also works great. There are so many rabbit holes that you can fall down trying to research, what do I record on? What do I edit on? What microphone should I use? What pop filter should I use? How should I do these things? And again, I would rather see you start it and get really passionate and really enjoy it than spend all of your time doing research to the point that you never launch the project, because that is such an easy thing to do. It's easy to do the research. It's easy to make lists and it's easy to plan. It's harder to execute, which is why this consistency of my own podcast is not great. I can talk about lots of things, but getting me to sit down and record in the right space and the headspace and have my notes all written out, that's the challenge. And that's where the work is, for me at least. And finally, there is the cover photo. And this, obviously, if you are going out and reaching a new audience, obviously the cover photo matters. I see people not get started because they feel like they don't have the right tools or the right recording space or the perfect headshot. And all of these things can be true, but they can also just be a stumbling block that we put in our own way. I have changed the cover of this podcast at least 3 times. At least. It might be more, but at least 3 times I have changed the cover of this podcast. At some point, I might change it again. Maybe even soon, because I recently cut off all of my hair. And in that picture, I have long hair and now I have short hair. And that's kind of a weird thing for me. But maybe I'll leave it because it's a really good photo. But whether or not I have the perfect cover photo for my podcast isn't necessarily the thing that would get somebody to listen. Obviously, it matters, yes, but there are more things to worry about, especially if you're just launching. Like, save that for 6 months down the road when you have your feet under you and you have some comfort and you have some confidence in what you're doing and you know that you're going to be doing it long term before you go book an entire headshot session just for a new podcast. That's all I'm saying. So next, I want to talk about things I did right and things I did wrong when I was first starting. And I'm going to go with the things that were learning opportunities. Let's not say I did them wrong. Let's just say that they were learning opportunities. So the first one, again, this is more of a learning opportunity than a right or a wrong. When I first recorded my episodes, my podcast episodes, probably the first 10 or so, were done with a lapel mic and GarageBand on my phone. Because that's what I had. I had a lapel mic because I have taught video courses. I have recorded videos where I needed a lapel mic. And so that was the microphone that I had. And then I recorded directly onto my phone and edited with GarageBand. The challenges there, for me especially, was that manipulating my phone and trying to do edits and cuts with just my fingers when I'm not very good at GarageBand was a challenge. That was definitely a big challenge. I also used to try to edit and record in the same day. That my method now is that I record 4 to 5 episodes all at once in about an hour or so, and then I leave them alone for a week, maybe more. I need to let them sit, because what I found is that when I was trying to record and then immediately go into edit, because at one point I decided I would just record 1 per week and then edit it the same day and get it out. So 1 episode per week. That made sense to me. But what I found is that I was so hypercritical of everything that I said that I would find myself wanting to go back and re-record because it was so fresh. And I was right there, and I my entire setup was there, and I could just pop in and re-record a piece or add something. And then I would find myself doing that, and it would take me hours to do that. And so eventually, probably by accident, I wasn't able to edit on the same day that I recorded. And I realized how much faster the editing process went when I felt like I was hearing it for maybe not the first time, obviously, because I wrote it and I said it, but when there was some distance and I wasn't as hypercritical. So that would definitely be one of my pieces of advice, especially if you're somebody who is very critical about what you do. Number 3, the learning opportunities for me is that my consistency on this podcast is honestly terrible. I want it to be better. I have episodes recorded, but I don't always get to it. And so I think if I could change one thing about the podcast and the way that I do it, I would like it to be more consistent. That is one of the things I am working on this year, but I've also been working on it since January, and now we're in September. So you can see how well I've been doing. I love recording the podcasts. I get the best feedback from them. I think they're amazing. I think it's a cool resource that I get to create, but I'm also not really great at consistency. So if you can create some sort of consistency, I think that would be good too. The things I got right when I started my podcast that I am very, very proud of is that before I launched, I recorded 10 episodes before I even launched. So I had those. Ideally, my plan was I would always have, 5 or 6 weeks planned out ahead. That has obviously not worked out for me. But originally I did launch with 10 episodes, and that gave me the space to sort of see how people responded to them and then plan for the next episodes without feeling like I had to do it right away. And that was really, really helpful for me. I also set up my podcast in its entirety, submitted it to all of the podcasting platforms, etc., at least a week before my podcast launch. And the reason that is important is because sometimes there are technological hiccups. Sometimes Apple takes a little bit of time to process something. Sometimes other platforms do. And so if I had tried to do it all in the same day or within a couple of days of each other, it might have caused a delay when I did launch my podcast. So doing that made it easier for me to launch. The other thing, and I think this is something that a lot of people who are considering a podcast maybe think about or wonder about, is will I have enough content? And the way that I got around that for myself is that I wrote out over 50 topics that I could write about. And every time I have a new idea, I just add it to that list. So everything that you're hearing that I have ever created for this podcast came from a master list. And when I am in the mood to record a podcast, or when I have time, it's not necessarily a mood thing. When I actually have time in my schedule to record a podcast, I pull from that list and I see what is sparking me in that moment, what I think my audience is responding to, what I'm seeing in the world, what needs to be talked about. And so I never come to write a podcast episode with a completely blank slate. I always have topics and ideas already planned out. So now that we've covered why I started Adventures in Marketing, what I've learned, some pitfalls, some things to be aware of, I want to share the tools that I use because I really like the tools that I use. I don't do any affiliate marketing, so I will put the links in the show notes, but they're just clean links. I'm not making money off of recommending these things. I have a Blue Yeti microphone. At some point, I will upgrade this. But again, even the idea of digging into reviews and trying to figure out what's going to work when I know that this works, I am not super inclined to do that. But someday I will replace it. It is a secondhand Blue Yeti Snowball microphone. It works great. I have it on an arm that attaches to my desk, and when I am not podcasting, it folds away, and so that it is safe and out of harm's way, and also out of my way when I use my desk. My podcast host is Simplecast. I've been really happy with them. If you go to the website, you will see their branding is really fun and fresh, and honestly, that's probably part of the reason that I liked it. Of all of the things that kind of stood out to me, I've never had a problem with them. The customer service is great. The tutorials are great. Uploading a podcast is super easy. Everything was just super easy to use, and so that's why I like Simplecast. One of the questions that comes up often is, I want to transcribe my podcast. How do I do that? I use a service called Otter.ai. That is an automated service. I just upload my file, and then in a couple of minutes, they spit out a fairly decent transcript. It's not always perfect, and you do need to go over it, but it's pretty close. You can also hire an actual person to transcribe for you if you prefer that, just like you can hire a podcast editor or a podcast producer so that you don't have to do that behind the scenes work if that is too stressful for you. But I've been pretty happy with Otter AI. And again, I don't make enough podcasts to need it every single month. I think, like I said, I think you get 2 per month that are free, I think is how that works. In the show notes, I will link a blog post that I have about where to find free and royalty-free music that you can use for your podcast. Again, I opted not to use it, partly because I knew that I would fall down the internet research rabbit hole and never come out, because I will never find something that I love. But if you are somebody who wants music and that's an important piece of your podcast, then you can definitely find some really great free and low-cost options for your podcast. And I will put that in the show notes. I will also in the show notes put a podcast promotion freebie link that you can download, a guide that shows, I think it's 10 or 20 different ways to promote your podcast once you have created it. And speaking of promoting, if you're going to make a podcast, it makes sense to promote it. But you might be thinking about how to do that. So one of the things you can do is send it to your email list. Some podcasters make a specific email every time they release a new podcast episode. So if you make a new podcast episode every week, that is an automation that you can set up that sends it out to your list that, hey, there's a new podcast episode, go listen. Others roll it into their regular weekly emails, and some people do both. Another way that you can promote your podcast is if somebody has a question and you happen to have a podcast that answers that or that addresses that, you can share the link with them so that they have that resource. You can, again, turn your blog posts into a podcast or your podcasts into blog posts. There's definitely lots of ways to repurpose this content that you have. You can use the show notes to promote this specific episode of your podcast, but then also other podcast episodes that would be related or would be good to listen to. You can also do what I do and send them to blog posts or other resources in the show notes. That's another really clever way to do it. In the show notes, I will leave a downloadable PDF for you so that you can see a ton of different ways to promote your podcast beyond just the couple that I mentioned here. I think the list has 20 on it. There's lots of different ways, and there's probably more ways than I thought of, but that's a good place to start. Whew. Okay, so to wrap this up, when you are thinking about making a podcast, it is really easy to get caught in the research of the right microphone, the right tools, the right format, all of those things. But I think what it really comes down to is making a podcast that is authentically you. Make a podcast that you would be proud of. Don't make a podcast that you are trying to mimic somebody else's format or somebody else's topics because you think that that's the way to do it because you see them doing well. There can only be one of you and there can only be one of them. So make the podcast that is you, that is something that you are proud of, something you want to promote versus something you feel like you have to make because everybody else is making something in the same way. Another thing that I haven't talked about yet is pod fade. And that is the fact that after about 7 episodes, a lot of podcasts stop being made. It's not, I don't want to say it's hard to make a podcast, but it does take time and it does take dedication and it does take effort. And so a lot of people start a podcast and then after about 7 to 10 episodes, they drop off. That's why I suggest that you have 7 to 10 episodes recorded ahead of time before you launch. 1, to get you over that slump. And then 2, so that you have a little bit of space to record more episodes and so that you don't get stuck in that 7 episode issue. Another way to get past that pod fade or that piece where it drops out of your system or you stop making podcasts, if it's something that you want to do, and also just to make it easier for you in general, is to start thinking about systematizing how you create podcasts wherever you can. So if you have a guest, if you're thinking of launching a podcast that has guests, get a scheduling form, get a Calendly or some other calendar form set up so that they can book with you so that you're not going back and forth in email because you do not have time for that. Think about ways that you can plan and prep ahead of time. Think about using the same Canva graphics or the same social media graphics, however you want to call it, to promote new episodes instead of creating something from scratch every time. Like maybe it's your podcast cover art and you change the title of the episode, however that works. But don't feel like you have to create new podcast graphics from scratch with an entirely new design every time. Number 1, it's not great for branding because you want people to recognize your podcast graphics. But also you don't have time to do that. That takes more time than you want to spend, because you want to spend time on growing your business and on making more episodes and connecting with guests or finding listeners, not necessarily spending all your time making graphics. It's also helpful to plan ahead for seasonal or time-specific topics. So, for example, if you know that you have a topic that is really related to the holidays, plan that into your calendar and get that one recorded months before you need it, if possible, or at least weeks before you need it, so that you're not feeling a time crunch. It also helps you fill up your content calendar. If you know that, in November, for example, if you are a chef, you want to talk about turkey options, and in December, you want to talk about something else. Being able to plan that kind of content ahead of time will save you so much stress. I use a list of 50 topics, but if a calendar works better for you because the things that you're going to talk about are time sensitive, then do that. It makes more sense. And then at some point, it might be that your podcast comes to an end. Just because you start a podcast doesn't mean that you are stuck doing it forever. Every one of us has projects that have a certain lifespan, and then they run their course and we're done with them. And that's okay. In fact, 75% of podcasts are no longer being made. They were started. Maybe they made it to the 7 episodes. Maybe they made it to 3 episodes. Maybe they made it to 120 episodes or 1,000 episodes. And at some point, the person behind the mic decided that that wasn't how they wanted to spend their time anymore. And that's okay too. It's okay to pick up a project and try it and experiment with it and then put it down if it doesn't feel right, or if it doesn't make sense in your time right now, or whatever reason you want. Don't think that just because you start something, you have to be stuck with it forever. So hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully this answered some questions. If there's something that I forgot, if there's some podcast question that you have that I didn't answer, please send me an email, gwen@gwenmontoya.com. You can always reach me there. You can also find more about me at gwenmontoya.com. Join my Adventures in Marketing group. It is an amazing kind of mastermind-like group of people that are working on their business day by day, step by step, and it's fantastic. So definitely come check us out. And thank you for listening.